Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Lesak, wildlife biologist for DeWitt and Goliad counties. I will now discuss the remaining 4 practices and activity options that will fit into each. They will include providing supplemental water, providing supplemental food, providing shelters, and performing census counts and surveys. The first category I will cover is supplemental water. Water is a great attractant for wildlife, and there is a lot of options to providing supplemental water. If you determine that water is a limiting factor for wildlife on your property and choose it as one of your 3 practices, you can achieve this by either developing or restoring marsh and wetland areas, constructing water wells, troughs, or windmill overflow sites, or creating a guzzler system. You can also choose to do spring enhancement or development. Be sure to check with your local comprehensive guidelines to determine your minimum intensities for each project to qualify. You can be very creative with this. You just need to think about the availability to the animals of interest and how to make the water source sustainable. Troughs do not have to be big, and they can be homemade, as long as the water is available to the wildlife in a safe manner year-round. In-ground troughs with a pipeline source are excellent. You can see a few options in the top left corner. A guzzler can also be constructed to catch rainwater to store in a water source to be provided to wildlife. There are several designs online to construct these using a variety of materials. You can also set up a tank trough system that you deliver water to, or you can just simply set a trough up in the ground with a water hose maintaining the level. On page 6 of the plan, you should see an option for modifying an existing water source. If you have water sources on site from a previous livestock operation, there is potential to modify the source to make it more friendly and safe for wildlife. It is important to look at the design modifications for existing water sources to be sure your targeted wildlife species gets safe and effective use of the water that you provide. You can achieve this by allowing your windmill to overflow out of the trough or catchment system and create a pooling source of water on the ground or into a smaller water trough. You can install ramp systems in and out of existing water troughs. This will ensure wildlife get the water and escape if they happen to fall into the trough. How this design is implemented will be dependent on your individual water troughs. Here are some examples of trough modifications. As you can see in each picture, there is some sort of step or ramp source in the existing water source. Now that you are focusing on wildlife management for your property, you will want to make sure no animals are in danger of entrapment in an artificial water source. The 5th practice available, starting on page 7 of your example plan, is providing supplemental food. As Bobby mentioned earlier, there are several practices that fit into different categories depending on how you are using them. Providing supplemental food can be achieved by grazing management regime, using prescribed fire, range enhancement or reseeding of native species, creating food plots, providing feeders and mineral supplementation during critical periods of the year, and by managing your pastures, fields, and croplands to create wildlife-friendly areas. Providing productive quality habitat that meets the needs of wildlife species you are managing for is always the objective. Supplemental feeding is not a substitute for good habitat management. It should only be used in combination with a comprehensive management plan. Additionally, artificial food source should not be provided to the extent that it will increase the number of animals to a higher level than the native habitat can adequately support. This artificial food source should also not contradict other management objectives. So if you're accidentally providing nutrition to predators such as hogs and raccoons that will make them more healthier and more reproductively successful, it'll contradict your management goals of sustaining your targeted wildlife species. As I mentioned earlier, you can use livestock grazing as a tool for wildlife management. In this case, it would be to provide supplemental food. People often view livestock grazing as incompatible with wildlife management. However, grazing management, when properly applied, can be a very beneficial tool used to improve wildlife habitat. Please remember that since you are now managing your property for wildlife, livestock should be used as a tool for obtaining your wildlife goals and not as a means of income. You will have to become very flexible in timing, stocking rate, and usage of livestock. Using grazing in a deferred rotation system, where you have plenty of rest and recovery periods between grazing events, will mimic the historic grazing patterns of the bison. Livestock can be used to reduce grass density, and hoof action can stimulate fork growth, which will produce a food source for wildlife. Bobby mentioned that prescribed fire can be a tool for habitat management earlier in his program. It can also be used as a tool to provide supplemental food. Prescribed fire is an excellent tool for promoting plant diversity and controlling litter buildup. By resetting the successional stage of the habitat, fire can kickstart regrowth that provide luscious vegetation to wildlife. To use this properly, you will want to work with your local biologists to develop a prescribed burning plan for your property. Ideally, you will set up the plan to burn areas in a rotational pattern to ensure areas are in different successional stages, so all the needs of wildlife are met. This practice has the same intensity requirement as listed under habitat control in your comprehensive guidelines in your area. Range enhancement can also fit into the supplemental food category, and the requirements are the same in terms of intensity. If you choose this option for food, you will want to choose seeds that are native to your area and are the appropriate variety depending on your ecotype. Your local biologist can help you determine the best options for you and where to purchase the seed. To use food plots as a qualifying practice, you will need to plant a minimum of 1% of your acreage in both winter and summer food plots. You can use cool and warm season annual crops or plant annual and perennial mix of native plants. Feeders can also be used to provide supplemental food. However, you want to make sure you match feeders and food providing to your targeted wildlife species. The feeder must be a free choice and occurring every 320 acres with 16% crude protein, fed for deer, or a high diversity of seeds for birds. Practice 6 on page 8 of your wildlife management plan is providing supplemental shelter to wildlife. I will cover each of these practices in more detail, but you can qualify for this practice by using nest boxes or structures for your targeted wildlife species. Creating brush piles is also an option. Fence line management might be an option for some folks. Hay meadow, pasture, or croplands can be managed to provide shelter for wildlife. The half cutting of trees in areas with low understory could be beneficial as well as woody plant and shrub establishment. If your area is lacking natural cavities or snags, creating these can be a qualifying practice. The first option is to provide artificial nest boxes. Only a few birds will use artificial nest boxes, so please note that if a bird does not nest in cavities in the wild, it will not nest in an artificial box. So if your target species is cavity nesting songbirds, you can choose this practice of providing nest boxes. Choose a style of box or house that fits the species you are targeting. We have documents on the PropLebin website with specific dimensions and placements of these houses to best fit your targeted species. If you cannot find what you're looking for, you can reach out to your local biologist. Now, remember, you cannot just put these houses up in year one and then forget about them. The boxes must be maintained in good condition every year in order to qualify as a practice. These houses will have characteristics such as being constructed with untreated wood, an overhanging sloped roof, rough interior walls, a recessed floor with drainage holes, ventilation near the top sides of the walls, easy access for you to monitor and clean them, and no outside perches. The use of nest blocks have a minimum intensity, so check your local guidelines to determine what your exact numbers will be needed to place on your property. If you choose to place artificial nest boxes, it cannot be stressed enough that predator guards are highly recommended when using artificial nesting structures for targeted wildlife. Items such as stovepipe baffles will prevent raccoons, snakes, cats, and squirrels from climbing up the pole to the nest box. Guards can be made from stovepipe, PVC pipe, or metal sheeting, whatever you have around the house or can find at your local hardware store to create some sort of cone to prevent unwanted guests from climbing up the pole. The use of an entrance guard will protect and thicken the entrance area, which makes it more difficult for predators like raccoons and possums from reaching into the nest box, while also making it harder for squirrels to chew a larger opening into the box. Here you can see a good example of a nest box in the upper right corner. It has the sloped overhanging roof, a thicker entrance guard. You can see some ventilation here in the top of the sidewall, and also the recessed floor with no perching location. Moving on to brush piles. This will address the lack of understory or shrub habitat and create cover. If you are thinning any monocultures of huisache, ash juniper, or cedar, you can create brush piles for cover. A minimum of 3% of the designated area must be treated annually. This practice can help understory songbirds, quail, reptiles and insects, as well as small mammals. Fence line management can be applicable in areas where cover is limited, like croplands or tame pastures. There is a minimum width and length you must establish depending on your ecoregion. Check with your local area to learn the exact requirements. You can reseed these areas or just let wildlife replant the fence line for you. Altering traditional practices in hay meadows, pasture, and croplands can create shelter for wildlife. Mowing or baling should be postponed until after the peak nesting and fawning season. Also, you can mow and shred only 1/3 of the open areas each year to keep cover on the ground. It is best to do this in strips or mosaic patterns to create edge and structural diversity. Now that wildlife is your main focus, adopting practices such as reducing or eliminating the use of weed control is recommended. Allowing these weedy species to grow in your open areas will create a food source and more cover for wildlife. These practices will improve the plant diversity, which will benefit ground nesting birds and other mammals, as well as insects and wintering grassland birds. These management practices can also be done to manage your native grasslands and savannas too. While some mature mesquite trees provide adequate loafing cover, multi-stemmed regrowth mesquite usually does not. However, the cover value of such mesquite can be enhanced with a process called half-cutting. Half-cutting seeks to transform a multi-stemmed mesquite into a living brush pile. The only equipment needed to half-cut mesquite and other brush is a limb saw. Select only those trees with smooth bark. Typically, they're going to be 1.5 inches in diameter or smaller, and trees that have 6 to 10 stems. While pulling down one of them with moderate pressure, score the limb with the saw at about waist level. When you've sawed through nearly half, the limb should break over. Continue until all limbs are broken over into a wagon wheel shape arrangement. Depending on the tree, you may wish to leave one or two of the central limbs uncut to provide a conical shape to the tree. It is best to do this in early or middle part of the growing season. Also, don't just cut one single tree. It is recommended to cut 5 to 10 over the size of a basketball court in order to create islands of loafing cover. Then move over about 200 yards and clone this configuration. You may wish to cut selected trees between islands to act as travel lanes. Mesquites aren't the only species of tree that can be half cut. Hackberries have also been used, but hackberries may be browsed by cattle and surely by deer, which might prevent it from actually providing cover. In order to qualify for this practice, a minimum of one clump of trees per 100 yards on at least 10% of the acreage, or 10 acres, whichever is smaller, must be done annually to qualify. If you would like a more natural shelter source, you can choose the practice of creating natural cavities or snags. A minimum of 5 snags per acre on 5% of the acreage must be retained or created annually to qualify. If you choose this option, it is best to avoid girdling mass-producing trees such as oaks and hickories, and choose a more undesirable species. Often, people do not want to purposely harm a living tree, so I personally have not seen this practice used much. However, as just a general wildlife management practice, if you happen to have some trees die, and they are in areas where they won't harm humans or structures if they fall, let them decay naturally in place instead of removing them. This will create habitat and a food source for many species. It won't necessarily meet the recommendation as a qualifying practice for your wildlife valuation tax plan. However, it is something to think about adding to your wildlife management plan. The remaining practice is surveys to determine population trends. You may ask yourself, why are surveys important? Well, they are vital prerequisites for many wildlife management techniques. They may provide knowledge of which species you need to focus on, and they are important for responsible harvest of selected game species. They also provide a good picture of health and diversity of the environment, and they can be the currency by which the success of management programs are judged. The different survey options that you can do include spotlights or aerial counts, daylight deer, herd, and wildlife composition counts, harvest data collection and record keeping, a browse utilization survey, census and monitoring of endangered, threatened, or protected wildlife, and census and monitoring of non-game wildlife. You may ask yourself, well, which one should I choose? Well, it really is going to depend on which species you're targeting. If you're focusing your management on large mammals, you can look at the following: stand counts, spotlight surveys or aerial surveys, and if done properly, you can use motion-sensitive camera surveys. If you're focusing on birds, you could choose point count or feeder counts, or nest box searches. An all-around good practice is to monitor your vegetation, natural vegetation on your property. You can do this by plant composition surveys or browse utilization. Stand counts is when a single observer sits quietly in a deer stand or blind during the early morning or late evening hours and records wildlife species coming to a pre-placed wildlife feeder. Generally, it is required at least 5 stand counts for a decent estimate are done in a season, and you want one stand surveyed per 100 to 200 acres annually. If you own more than this 200 acres, you will need to set out multiple stands and have individuals sitting in them at the same time during the survey period to get a good overall picture of your species you're surveying. Spotlight surveys require a pickup truck, one driver, and 2 observers with spotlights and preferably binoculars. The driver will follow a predetermined route and drive between 5 and 15 miles per hour, and the observers will identify and count all wildlife they see. It's important to have the binoculars so that you can distinguish between bucks, does, and fawns, and also any other wildlife you might be interested in. Moving on for bird type surveys, you can use as I mentioned, you can use point counts, feeder counts, or nest box searches. Feeder counts are very typical to stand counts. A single observer will sit in a blind during the early or late periods of the day and identify and count all birds coming into a pre-placed feeder. Again, at least 5 counts should be performed per feeder per season to get a good overall assessment of the bird species on the property. Nest box searches should be done periodically and checked during the breeding season to determine what species are using the boxes, the number of eggs, and the number of fledged young. It's important to not disturb the nest too frequently, and so approaching the nest quietly is important. If you can do this by just standing back a good feet to determine the species and perhaps the number of young, that is a better option. Evaluation of the use of key plant species to determine animal impacts on shrub species is a helpful tool in population management. Overuse of certain shrubs in the winter period can indicate high populations of deer. If you choose to monitor your vegetation with a browse survey, you collect data in the late winter months. Identify at least 5 areas on the property with good brush diversity, and select a minimum of 3 plants per species in that area. You then sample 100 stem temps and count the number of bites. This data can be used to adjust management recommendations in the future. If you would like to conduct browse surveys on your property, you can contact your local wildlife biologist for more information on procedure and survey setup to get this information. Other surveys you can conduct include bat departures from either natural areas or structures that you put up that are artificial for the bats to use. You can collect harvest data collection on your game species. This information would include sex of animal, age, and antler characteristics if it's a deer. You can also do butterfly diversity and bird diversity indexes on your ranch. So it's important to remember that a total count or census is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to conduct. We can't even count how many people are in the United States, so you can imagine how hard it would be to count all of the wildlife on your property. No survey method is available that's available for wildlife is 100% accurate 100% of the time. So it's important to conduct multiple surveys and compare the results. You might ask yourself, which survey do I use? That will depend on what wildlife species you're interested in, how much time you have to devote to the surveys, how much area you have to survey, and what kind of habitats you have. Use these 4 questions to determine which surveys you will use. Now that we have reviewed all possible practices you can do on your property, think about what the limiting factors on your property are that might be hindering wildlife. Once you figure that out, choose the practices that will fill the void for your targeted species. When you're developing your wildlife management plan, you want to think about each practice and what it should achieve. For each management practice, explain what species are being targeted or will benefit from this practice, how each species may benefit, how specifically you plan to implement the practice, for example, what tools will you use, and how often and what time of the year will it be conducted. Also, mention the acreage that will be affected for each practice and cross-reference it on a map to show where you'll be implementing it. This will be very important to have on hand when you're completing your annual report. Your tax appraisal office is interested in making sure that you are meeting the criteria required by law and that you are making a good faith effort to implement your wildlife management plan. So you might be asking yourself, what if? So just know that the law does not require you to be successful, either in traditional agriculture or in the wildlife management option for tax valuation. It only requires that you meet the criteria for each practice and demonstrate that you provided a good faith effort to provide that source for the wildlife. If you would like more information, you can visit the website at the top of the page. This is where all of our information on the Prop 11 process and procedures is housed. Simply click on your county and find your ecoregion to find more information on each of these practices we have discussed. And you can also print your wildlife management plan or annual report at the bottom of the page.